I think it would be a stretch to ever say I've had a plan. I saw an opportunity and I thought differently. We need, as brands, to bear in mind that we don't have a God-given right to the attention of the people sat on their sofa. And if we're lucky, we might get their attention. This probably was all happening at 10:30 p.m. And my wife sat next to me going, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, you won't believe me.
For this episode of the Leeds Creative Folk podcast, I sat down with Dom Dwight, Strategy and Innovation Director at Taylors of Harrogate, and one of the key figures behind the meteoric rise of Yorkshire Tea. We chatted about his meandering journey through a career where creativity in its many guises has been at the core of everything he's done. Were you a creative kid? Like when you were a child, were you quite an arty type?
It's one of those things about to what extent did you have encouragement and what did you have encouragement around? And I think because I wasn't particularly sporty or anything as a kid, I was really happy to be laid on my belly on the living room floor, on the carpet, with a pad of paper and some pens. My kind of earliest memories about creativity were really about about doodling. There were probably loads of different comic references I could talk about that would make me sound cool, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be honest and I think probably Garfield, Jim Davis. My earliest memory was just copying Garfield cartoons and then doing versions of the cartoons where I wrote my own stupid comments in the speech bubbles and things like that.
Yeah, I totally remember that. And I couldn't draw, but I kind of liked tracing because then it looked like I could draw.
There was a period when I was young where my mum got a Saturday job and my dad he worked in the building industry as a kind of big project manager. So on Saturdays, my sister and I would get woken up early, chucked in the car and driven off to work with my dad. And I'd be sat in a porter cabin while my dad was busy doing building stuff. And me and my sister would be left with a big pad of paper and some pens. And I just used to amuse myself by just doodling for hours and hours at a time. And I was very happy to do that. So that's kind of, forced through circumstances. But the encouragement thing, I guess, is that every now and then I'd doodle something and I'd show it to my mum and dad. And I just remember feeling really chuffed whenever they liked something so much they stuck it on the fridge or they showed it to my aunties or something like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think that thing of almost being forced to sort of entertain yourself or find that. I think there's so much value in that. Like me and my wife talked a lot when my kids were younger about it's the sort of value of them being bored because then they have to find their own entertainment. And I grew up, we didn't have a TV until I was 10. And so we had to kind of make our own entertainment. And I feel like that was really, really important, really impacted me. And
I totally agree. But I then have this kind of watch out that I don't want to become one of the older generation that sort of says, you don't really understand, you don't know you were born, that kind of thing. Because I guess I did have the TV and I kind of sometimes think I was partially raised by the TV. I watched far too much of it when I was young, but cannot tease it apart from how my brain works today. A lot of the way I think and where my creativity comes from TV shows, comedies. It also actually comes from ads. I think there's a lot about the industry I work in now and how my view of good and bad advertising is really informed by the stuff I noticed when I was watching telly when I was 10.
Were there are there ones that stick in your head, like ads?
Yes,
that really caught your attention?
I've got a thing about music in ads, and I feel like not just use of normal music, but actual kind of comedy songs and that kind of thing. I think that was used more, and it's probably seen as a bit cliched and hackneyed now, but the red car and the blue car had a race for Milky Way.
Yeah.
I feel like that should actually be played at my funeral. Even though that would be weird.
I'm pretty sure I could sing that whole thing to you.
All the lyrics.
Now,
we're going to do it? No.
No.
Another one, though, would be I think there was it's ironic that I can't quite remember which tyre brand it was for. Think it will be for Goodyear. But it was this tyre brand that used Venus in Furs by the Velvet Underground. And it was a really mad ad that was just a scene of the desert. And it had a big fat guy that was entirely painted silver. And I'm pretty sure it almost showed no cars. So I just remember being really struck by that as a kid and thinking, I think, not that I would have phrased it this way as an 11-year-old or whatever, but I just loved the sort of ballsiness of an ad that was going to be so out and out creative to get your attention, but wasn't doing the kind of logical thing of like, let me talk to you about why our tyres are good. So yeah, I've always been struck by the creativity of good advertising, I think.
I was totally obsessed with the Guinness surfer ad. And that's the kind of like sort of one that often gets referred to. But I think there was something so incredible, like as a piece of filmmaking, piece of kind of storytelling, drama, just visual sort of whatever. It was phenomenal. That kind of really caught my I mean, I credit that to some degree with where I've ended up kind of working, because it really just caught my attention in a totally different way to anything else.
Same. That's another one for me, is just whenever you've got ads where the visuals are just really stunning and they just feel really like almost bold to the point of being irreverent, like they're not respecting what's gone before them and they've just got a different vision to bring. But also they often bring like music that's edgy or different or really unexpected to combine with the visuals. Like I guess I'm making it sound like I'm a bit obsessed with advertising, but I suppose I'm jumping to the link between all the stuff that's influenced me creatively as a kid and what I find myself doing now. I do think there's no accident that I was exposed to that stuff, and there were things about it that I admired, which I've kind of ended up drifting into career-wise.
Was music a sort of big thing for you as a kid? Was that like a...
Yes, very into music. I learned the drums when I was sort of 15 and was in a band. And for quite a long time, I think any creative energy I had, that was my outlet for it. It all went into kind of musical expression. And because I was born in the late 70s, I'm a child of grunge. So, I spent my early 90s like just smashing the shit out of drums and trying to be Dave Grohl, and experimenting with how much distortion you could use on a melody before you couldn't hear the melody anymore, so.
At what stage did you kind of decide that something creative was what you wanted to do for work? Was that like something you kind of planned, or is that just almost where you ended up?
I think it would be a stretch to ever say I've had a plan. The two areas that I was most interested in, so I was like an avid reader and a bit of a writer. So I had a pop a few times at like writing short stories and things and getting nice feedback from teachers or parents that kind of encouraged me to keep doing that. But really drawing and doodling was more where I was focused. And then through GCSE and A-levels, I just kind of noticed that as the numbers of people in the groups dwindled, I felt like I stood out as like way less technically capable than my peers, especially during our A-level. So I felt like sometimes I would do things and they would be really nuts. So I had kind of confidence that my imagination was up to scratch, but like my ability to kind of draw as well as my peers, I just fell behind, I think. I did one work experience, the stuff you do when you're like 15 or 16. I did 5 days of work experience at Saatchi, which is like part of the benefit of growing up in the southeast. You've got London on your doorstep. You've got millions of places to choose from. And I don't know how, I didn't know anyone. I was just lucky that they opened my letter and didn't throw it in the bin. And I went to Saatchi thinking, I quite fancy being one of those people who's got just like a drawing board in front of you and loads of cool magic markers, and you just do kind of storyboards and things like that. And I saw those people and I saw their studio and I was like, this looks great. I'd love this life. And then I went on and I spent some time, I sat in with a creative duo, so like a copywriter and an art director. And they were basically like spitballing ideas to respond to a Tetley's bitter brief. And I was just like 15, 16-year-old kid just sat in the back listening. But I just loved it, like what they were doing, because they were basically just having a laugh and building an idea together and doodling some pictures. And then they kind of at one point were like, I think we've got something. And I just went away thinking, I can't believe that's a job. So at that point in my life, I was like, I think that's what I'd like to be. So I kind of went to uni thinking, I don't know what I want to do, but I just don't really want to become part of a big machine and sell out and all those things. That's kind of how, when I left uni, I ended up working for Leeds Guide magazine, because it's a small indie business, and at least that way I was like, what I was doing for a living was writing. So it wasn't the creative fiction that I might have had in my head once upon a time, but I still just really loved the process of writing.
Had you sort of sort of set out an idea of, yeah, I'd really like to write for a living. I really enjoy writing. That's something I'd like to use. Or was it just kind of looking around at jobs and thinking, oh yeah, I could do that?
I basically met someone who worked for Leeds Guide and they needed contributors. So I started writing the odd bit and bob for free. And then they liked what I did and a job came up and then I ended up going to work there for 7 or 8 years, I think.
Ah, right. I didn't realise you'd been there that long. Yeah.
Yeah, I got there when it was, it had been running for a few years before I joined, but it was just on the verge of turning from kind of almost a fanzine into more of a serious, like, let's try and do this properly type thing. Yeah, I felt like I was part of a really lovely phase for that magazine where we were kind of growing alongside the city growing, you know, like there was just this period where it just felt like Leeds was already this bustling, exciting, interesting city, but there were all these waves of change. And so it was really cool being able to write about those things and to get to know the people that were involved in making all those changes happen.
What sort of change were you seeing at that time in Leeds?
What I think I noticed was just how much like the real kind of creative energy in Leeds was actually being driven by all these different characters. And a lot of it was done through just like personal drive and passion. But a nice part of it was, you know, that they weren't totally on their own because they actually kind of knew each other. And there was this, you know, sometimes they'd be in competition with each other, but they'd still like collaborate and look out for each other. You know, silly example would be, I remember some of the bar guys talking about, you know, if like one bar ran out of limes, even though it was a totally different competing business, you knew that you could like run across the street and go get a barrel of limes from Mojo. And
that's really cool.
There'd be no hassle about it.
So then you went from working at Leeds Guide to Taylors.
Mm-hmm.
And what made you want to kind of, I guess it's a bit of a shift. There's the kind of writing element, but you're doing it in a kind of comms sort of context or marketing and comms context. What sort of drew you into that as an area of work?
Google and the internet in general was essentially just like totally destroying the business model of small regional publishers that depended on small bits of advertising from lots of little businesses who were all suddenly going, oh, I should spend my money on search instead of you guys. So I felt like the writing was on the wall for our industry and that it was time for me to get a more serious, grown-up, dependable job. But I still had this kind of sense of I don't really see myself being part of a big corporate machine. So when I learned a bit about Betty's and Taylors and I kind of learned that they were family owned and basically still felt very human and like a nice group of people, I thought I like the sound of that company. And then the more I looked into them and I found out that there was this job going to be the company's internal copywriter, I was like, well, that's still writing and it's also still food and drink, which food and drink was kind of like my main thing from Leeds Guide. And I did have a slight hang up that to go from journalism into copywriting, marketing, PR was like joining the dark side. Because, you know, journalism is where all the integrity's at, right? Except, you know, I look back on that now to think, God, it's mad to think I even thought that for a second. Because in journalism, especially like magazine and lifestyle journalism, you are still selling something. You're selling the brand of that magazine. And then going to work for Betty's and Taylors, it wasn't like I joined this cruel, like ruthless, avaricious beast. It was like a really lovely company that took real pride in the things it made. I'd be busy doing writing, but I had quite a lot of spare capacity and I just started messing around on the internet. And that's how I kind of found out that there was this thing called Twitter. This is like 2008. So for me to have discovered that was quite unusual. It wasn't like, you know, as obvious as it is today. There's nothing like inherently creative about doing marketing or doing social media, but I do think there was something, maybe it's more innovative to just look at this space and think, I wonder what would happen if we went onto that space.
You say there's nothing inherently creative about it, but maybe that's down to what your definition of creative is. In that, like you say, innovation, any form of innovation is driven by creativity, I guess. So it's not creative in the context of like, you know, what the creative industries mean or whatever, but it's surely is still creativity.
Yeah, that's true. I was probably being a little bit too kind of unwilling to say it that way because I think I do agree that I prefer that kind of definition of creativity that includes kind of thinking differently, you know, so it can be lateral thinking, it can be kind of radical problem solving. It doesn't have to be you can draw a really good picture or write a wonderful poem or something. Like, I love the broadest definition of creativity, and I think that's probably what I mean about arriving at Betty's and Taylor's at a really good time for me and for them, because I saw an opportunity and I thought differently. And when I raised it and suggested it, instead of it being a computer says, no, we don't do that stuff, they were really open to it. And I think that's paid dividends, because Yorkshire Tea being able to get active on social media in the really early days of brands on social media means that by the time it became a thing, I felt like we were quite adept. We'd learned a lot of lessons by getting things wrong in the old days. But I just really miss the period when social media just felt like each day was a kind of day of like discovery and mischief and joy. You'd either like connect with people and think, how crazy is this that I'm connected to this person? There was a really weird time where I found myself Yorkshire Tea, so not me on behalf of Yorkshire Tea, but obviously it was really focused on Yorkshire Tea. We had befriended Tim Burgess, the lead singer of the Charlatans, who had forsaken sort of drugs and booze and rock and roll for kind of meditation and tea drinking. So we became online buddies. And then this was all at the same time as Yorkshire Tea had, like, really unexpectedly had a strange cameo in the TV series Homeland, starring Damian Lewis.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So basically we got a tip off that our brand gets mentioned in this show, which seemed like the most unlikely thing. And when we did get a mention, it was like, ooh, that was cool. We got a lot of attention on social media for it. But by like 2 or 3 episodes later, it turned out that the mention wasn't just this rogue mention. It was a plot device. And there was an important thing that happens in the story where our tea being his favourite tea comes back up, and it's quite a crucial thing. So we were like, we do not know how this happened. But the strange triangle was that I ended up on an online conversation with Tim Burgess about this show Homeland that he was also watching, where we were speculating about why is Yorkshire Tea mentioned in this program.
It sounds it's like a fever dream or something, isn't it?
And this probably was all happening at like 10:30 p.m. and I'm tweeting from my sofa and my wife sat next to me going, what are you doing? And I'm like, you won't believe me.
It seems like one of the key things there in terms of you coming in to Taylor's was that sort of freedom or openness, maybe, rather than freedom, openness to ideas. And, you know, as we were saying, how do you define creativity or whatever? But it feels to me like it's that, you know, thinking of something new, thinking of something that hasn't been done before. You know, for me, that's very much sort of part of what creativity is. And was that sort of, do you feel like that was part of the kind of culture there? Was that sort of openness, or was it more just within the role that you'd been given?
I think this is something I kind of continue to try and balance now in a quite different role. But on the one hand, I think there are a lot of sort of forces of the conventional that can sometimes crush creativity or push it to the margins and stuff. I look back on those early days of Yorkshire Tea and think what you had a really strong core, like a really like well-functioning business and a brilliant brand, a brilliant product. So I think there was momentum there. So really coming in with some kind of interesting creative ideas was just a build on something that was already going really well. So I do think like there was a mixture of it was the right environment. I had some relevant like key big bosses that kind of looked at what I was saying and thought, I think you might be onto something. I mean, I feel quite fortunate with Lucky Generals, the creative agency that we work with, that we don't have this tussle, but sometimes you can get into this fight between the kind of the marketing team or the brand's point of view on like, this is why we need this advert to exist and what it's got to do. And then the creative side that's kind of got to get the balance right of like, if you just try and crowbar in all those messages or all that branding, or you're too obvious about it, then the ad just won't work. But the truth is it can go the other way. I've worked on campaigns where they've been like highly creative, like really cut through and attention grabbing. But because what they don't communicate is kind of what's the main message behind the brand, or they don't communicate like some of those basics about use your distinctive brand assets so you leave an impression. Because if people kind of look up from their phone for a second and look at the ad that's interrupting their program and notice it, that's great. That's already a huge victory. But if they can't correctly attribute that ad to whichever brand it's supposed to be, or the message it leaves them with is like, don't really know something about pizza. It's that's a fail, isn't it?
Do you feel like the way that people consume these things now and the whole second screen thing or kind of shorter attention spans means that that's harder to do? So like, some of the advertising we were talking about before, or like you go back to classic ads like the Cadbury's Gorilla ad or even some of the Guinness ones or whatever, where actually if you ran that through the same filter, they might not be effective.
Yeah, maybe not.
And without sounding like a kind of, cynical, middle-aged man, but like, kids these days, short attention span. But that has had an impact.
Yeah.
Do you think on that sort of thing?
I think maybe one of the big things about the whole kids these days is it's not just kids. Like we do often talk about it. Like it's true that younger people watch a lot less linear TV than older people, but older people watch a lot less linear TV than they used to. Yorkshire Tea's definitely kind of been held aloft as an example of like getting it right. And by which I think I mean, if TV advertising is essentially an interruptive thing, so we need as brands to bear in mind that like we don't have a God-given right to the attention of the people sat on their sofa. And if we're lucky, we might get their attention, but we might get their attention and they might resent us because we are interrupting the thing they actually want to watch. So the trade is if we can be interesting, informative, useful, entertaining, whatever, as long as we provide some sort of value that they recognize, then we won't be a negative interruption in their life and we might be thought of a bit more positively. And then if you're clever, you can also add on top of that, like we've got a couple of key messages we were hoping to land. It's lovely when you see other brands that are doing that too. So you mentioned so Cadbury's Dairy Milk and the Gorilla ad, it's one of my faves. I just love how bonkers it is. But I think probably what they did over time is did a really good job of kind of getting Cadbury's into people's minds, but it didn't really go any further than that. What I think they've done with their latest campaign, don't know how many of them you've seen or will remember, but there's quite a few and they're a lot more emotional. My favorite one is the one where it's like a guy that goes to a petrol station late at night, and while he's buying and paying for his fuel, he buys a big bar of dairy milk, and then he leaves it behind for the girl who's working on the counter at like 2:00 in the morning, and he says, "That's for you," which just seems like a nice act for a stranger. But then as he walks back to the car, the lady on the tannoy says, "Thanks, Dad." So it just becomes this touching moment between father and daughter. And yeah, it's nice when you see other ads where they've got that kind of like delicate balance going on.
Yeah, definitely.
They're not hiding the product, they're not hiding the message, but they've kind of wrapped it up in a way where you don't feel annoyed by the brand that they've bothered you with that message.
Yeah, definitely. I love those ads. Do you feel like in your job as it is now, like sort of creativity, I guess you're kind of looking quite a bit to the future and to, and I guess part of that is like we were talking about before, it's kind of innovation and it's coming up with ideas. Do you ever get sort of stuck creatively? Feel like I just can't sort of, and if you do, what do you do about it?
Yes, it can get hard because especially if you're working in tea and coffee, when you go around sort of asking what is going on in consumers' lives and what needs they might have, you do often go over the same ground, and you maybe done workshops before where you've come up with ideas. So it's quite hard to like forget the last time you workshopped this problem and think, well, no, we need to come up with something different. So that can be challenging. I got a book sent to me by Danny Brooke Taylor, who's one of the founders of Lucky Generals. He's the kind of top creative geezer. The basic concept of the book, you don't need to read. It's very thin, but you don't need to read it because I could sum it up in two things. It's like he basically suggests that if you've got a problem you're trying to solve, you need to study the hell out of that specific problem and try and know everything you can about get all the information, put it in your head, and then once you've got all the information, put that down, stop thinking about it, and go and do as many different things as you can. So just have a phase where you deliberately look elsewhere. Then you come back to your problem. And often what happens is you're basically forcing your brain to make unexpected lateral connections.
I remember hearing somebody talking about this a few years ago, and it's definitely something that I do. If I'm get stuck, I just try and go to a different place, or literally physically move. But then someone told me this thing of like, you should try and change routines in your life because it sort of activates your brain in a different way, because your brain goes to a certain kind of autopilot when you're doing something that you're so accustomed to doing. So things like drive a different way to work, or something we've started doing here is sort of periodically we'll just change where everyone sits in their office, because then who you're looking at, what you're looking at is different.
I was reading something about this the other day. It was unrelated in that it was not about how to be creative. It was more about why is it that life seems to go faster when you're older? Like time passes. So, like when you were younger and a summer holiday that was 6 weeks long felt like a lifetime. And nowadays, like I could be like, God, is it 2025? How did that happen? The theory is when you are younger, like most of the experiences you're having are novel, and novel experiences like leave more of an impression. So you're kind of almost counting all these increments. Whereas we're just like built to kind of automate things into routines because we're trying to constantly like optimize the amount of brain power we're using for stuff. So we then fall into routines, and physical routines like where you sit at work, or when you go for a tea break, or I don't know what radio station you listen to on the drive to work or whatever. So the point here was like, if you want to kind of feel like life isn't rushing past, like you can't obviously actually change time, but you can change your perception of time by making it kind of richer. And I quite liked that from the point of view of creativity, for exactly what you were suggesting. Is just you just mix up your routine a bit. The thing you change doesn't have to have anything to do with the problem you're trying to creatively crack.
Absolutely. Something we kind of talk about here is like when you're looking for inspiration or whatever, like I was saying before, the obvious places to go are kind of TV or film, or TV ads or whatever, but then try and look beyond that to like art or theatre or literature or dance or music or whatever. And I do find sometimes it's something really tangible, like you could look at a painting and you learn about the composition and whatever, and you can bring that into how you film something. But sometimes it's just about like the kind of feeling it provokes or something like that, or it just gets your brain in to a certain mode.
So I've been working on this exact thing in my head of like, how do we instill more creativity? How do I do it in myself? How do I do it in my team? You could end up doing things like thinking, oh, we all need to go to like an art exhibition. And while I feel like that would be a good thing to do, I feel sort of disappointed. It feels like we should find something less obvious. I was having a conversation early on today where one of my team has been watching the Wu-Tang series on Netflix, and they were just like buzzing with energy about how creative the depiction of what they did was, but also the depiction of creativity in the show. So there's like I haven't watched it myself yet, but it's totally on my list now. Like there's a scene where they devote quite a lot of time and space to how one of them is like building a track. And, even if you don't work in music, just watching a creative mind at work and seeing the process, seeing the kind of steps and the jumps can be really inspirational.
100%. Because there's creative processes in, all sorts of different fields, and they work very differently, and the outworkings of them are very different. But there's always like nuggets within there where you're like, oh yeah, that's the thing that I need to be thinking about. Or and like I say, sometimes it's more intangible than that, but it's just sort of getting your brain working in that way.
This has just reminded me of something. So they're almost going full circle. So if I sort of grew up reading like panel cartoon comic things, I actually find that I've gone back to that. Not the Far Side, but just my safe place on the internet these days. If I see stuff on Instagram, it's like those kind of like 4-panel crazy cartoons. So I'm both like amused by the silliness, but I'm also like walk away going like, whoa, an interesting idea. I love it when I find that on the internet.
Nice.
I think we need more of that in the world.
Definitely. Obviously, you don't live in Leeds as such, but it's still a sort of holds a special place for you.
Yeah, I worked here for a long time. I wrote about the city for a long time. I came up to uni to Leeds, so my reason for living and being in Yorkshire is all about Leeds. Really.
Yeah, I think Leeds has. I came to Leeds a few years after you, but you know, and it's changed a lot. It does have a certain kind of independent identity to it, which I really enjoy. I find really interesting. I think Leeds sometimes has a tendency not to want to shout about itself too much somehow, and is sort of lives slightly in the shadow of Manchester, maybe the north.
Yeah.
And it feels a shame. It's quite a Yorkshire thing, I think, being a bit self-deprecating, but then there's an extent to which you kind of want the city just to shout about itself a bit more because there's so much, it has so much to offer.
But there can be a kind of pride in living in the shadow of the more obvious choice. And I think I sort of feel that with Leeds, is that sometimes when the big money is spent, it kind of feels like that's not the bit that's actually interesting about the city. It's usually at the fringes. It's usually the slightly under-resourced, overlooked, independent stuff, you know, which I guess is true in quite a lot of cities, but I sort of feel like it stands out in Leeds. I think Leeds has probably got a lot more that it could shout about. What's
your favourite hidden gem in Leeds?
I don't know if this counts as a hidden gem because it's like loads of people know about it, but I honestly can't express how much I love the Brudenell Social Club. What I love about it is this idea that yet again you've got these independent, passionate people that have just devoted themselves to something, and because they've just programmed such interesting, eclectic music, I mean the range of stuff that plays at that venue is bonkers compared to what I knew it as in the mid-90s. So I love it. I love going to see gigs there. I was so like happy that like when my daughter was old enough to go to her first gig that it was there.
Oh, so, was it? That's cool.
Yeah. So that would be my not so hidden gem.
I like it. I think we'll let you have that.
Thank you.
If Leeds was a flavour of ice cream, what would it be?
Right. Okay. So it has to be something that is not over. I don't know. I'm going to say rum and raisin, but that is probably more because I just really like rum and raisin. No, I've got more reasons. So I love the bar Mojo, and I love the people behind the bar. And they had an upstairs room that was devoted to rum. And when I worked for Leeds Guide, I once had the horrible job of having to go there and review the place. And it involved Mal from Mojo just feeding me rum and telling me about each rum, and then I had to write notes, and then the next day with a terrible headache had to read those notes. Yeah. So yeah, rum and Leeds, I think there's a strong connection.
I like that. Yeah, good answer. If you had to describe Leeds in 3 words, what would they be?
So understated, independent, and gritty.
Nice. I like it. If you had to go somewhere in Leeds to feel inspired, where would you go?
I've just got this thing about independent business. Not that I like want to do it, but I just really admire other people that are doing it. And so there's a few, but for some reason, the people that jump out at me, Eat Your Greens, the little indie cafe grocery thing. There's a lovely atmosphere and a vibe to that place and those people. So
yeah, nice, very good. Who is a Leeds creative that people should know about?
Do you remember the graffiti artist Moose? Like
yes.
reverse graffiti. I don't know where he is now, but like there was this moment where like lots of big events like the Olympics and stuff were like using him or using his idea. And I just thought that was really cool to think that had come out of Leeds.
Thanks for doing that. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Too rambly or okay?
No, that was brilliant.